flattered and honored to be here. Thank you for all for coming. It's an honor to be speaking in this summer Cafe Scientifique series, which includes so many other interesting, inspiring, and renowned speakers. So that's quite an honor, and it's also a delight to be speaking in this beautiful building, perhaps the most beautiful building I've given a scientific talk in. So hopefully I'll be able to tell you something interesting about the Gulf of Maine. Because I'm a scientist and used to scientific talks, I like to do an outline at the beginning. So there's 4 parts to my talk. Darlene described me as a computational ocean ecologist. Another way to say that is an ecosystem modeler. That's the name that people like me usually go by, other than Mainer. But a lot of people don't know what that is. What is an ocean ecosystem modeler? In fact, I didn't know what that was when I started studying oceanography. So first, I'm just going to take a few minutes to give you a little bit of background on what that means, what the science that I do is like. And then we'll get into the Gulf of Maine, and I'll have 3 parts to that. First part, ye old Gulf of Maine, is a little bit of the historical context, going way back. And then I'll get into 40 years of change. We have this 40-year theme going on because this year is Bigelow's 40th anniversary since we were founded. So hence the 40 years of change. So I'll focus a bit on that time period. And then finish off with a little bit of what's going on in the Gulf of Maine today, some of the recent events. So to kick it off, what is an ecosystem modeler? It actually doesn't look like that at all. This is me modeling in the Gulf of Maine, but it actually involves a lot more time in front of the computer. An ecosystem is a really complex entity, and it's really difficult to define. I think one of the best ways to understand it is to get a picture of what some of the complexity looks like. And I'm going to do that by showing this video that NASA put together of the surface currents in the ocean. This is a video called Perpetual Ocean. So here, for example, you can see the Gulf Stream going up past the Gulf of Maine. We have all these eddies and vortices coming off of it. This is what the surface currents of the ocean look like pretty much all the time. You have more of those sort of eddies forming in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm just going to let this zoom around the world a little bit so you can take it in. To me, this is a work of art. We go down across the equator into the South Atlantic. We go over to the southern tip of Africa, the Benguela Current. You can see all of these vortices spinning off the current. Basically, the reason you see all of these vortices is a function of the fact that we live on a sphere that's rotating. We go back up into the Indian Ocean, where you see the effects of the monsoon winds sort of change the direction of currents all at once. I think we see that in a minute here. Then we come up, we're flying over up toward Japan now, where we see the Kuroshio. This is sort of the Pacific's equivalent of the Gulf Stream. They have a similar sort of warm water current moving up past the western side of the Pacific. And the video goes on for a bit. If you're interested in watching the whole thing, there's maybe 1 or 2 minutes beyond this, and I can show it again at the end. But what this really gives a sense of is the sort of complex dynamics that underlie everything that's happening in the ocean ecosystem. And this is the baseline. Okay, so here we have, these are the equatorial currents that sort of set up El Nino and La Nina events in the Pacific. So this is the sort of baseline that sets up what we have to understand as an ecosystem modeler. And to help understand what an ecosystem model does, I'm just going to walk through one example that I worked on a few years ago when I was working at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute in Portland. So this example was, what we were trying to do is forecast right whales in the Gulf of Maine. So forecasting weather is difficult enough. Forecasting the movements of an animal in an area as big as the Gulf of Maine is a real challenge. And the way you do that is by putting together an ecosystem model. The reason for doing this, by the way, is you may know that the northern right whale is one of the most endangered animals on the planet. There are only about 400 of them left in the world. They all come to the Gulf of Maine to feed, and their major sources of mortality are things like ship strikes and gear entanglements. In fact, if you look on the side of this whale, you can see a scar from a propeller from a ship strike. This whale survived, but that's a major source of mortality, one of the things that has been keeping the population from recovering. So the idea behind this project was, we can forecast where the right whales are going to be, we can help manage the species and avoid those sources of mortality. So, to forecast a whale is a challenge. You start with those currents. So this is Massachusetts Bay. You can see the arm of Cape Cod coming up on the right-hand side. And the arrows you're seeing are similar to the currents that I was just showing in that video. So you need to know, first of all, where the water is moving. And then on top of that, we have measurements of chlorophyll from satellites. I've just shown a static image here, but these are changing all the time, constantly with the currents. That's a measure of phytoplankton, the sort of base of the food web in the ocean. And you also have measures of temperature from satellites, which feeds into the ecosystem model as well. And then we have a bunch of equations that describe how different species grow and develop based on how they're eating phytoplankton, the chlorophyll, how they're developing based on temperature, and we try to describe with equations how they move through their life history and eventually multiply, reproduce, and create blooms of high abundance. So I'll show what that looks like in the next slide. This is the same map, and what you're seeing here are 3 different species of zooplankton. These are copepods. They're crustaceans about the size of a grain of rice. And the 4th one is just the total caloric content, if you were to add them all up. This is what whales are interested in eating. And you can see they're moving back and forth with the tides. Those oscillations you see are the tides that the Gulf of Maine is famous for. And you'll see different species sort of bloom at different times of the year. At first, there's a lot of this calanus species, which I'll talk more about later. Later on in the year, more towards March and April, you see more of the pseudocalanus in the upper right start to take over. And I'll let that run for a minute. And so you can think of this as forecasts of the food that whales are coming to Massachusetts Bay to eat. And so now you can see pseudocalanus sort of taking over. The final step is to use the food as prey fields for forecasting where whales are going to occur. And that's exactly what we did. We're producing weekly forecasts of where you're likely to see right whales in Massachusetts Bay and Cape Cod Bay. And these are just 4 different forecasts that we made at different times of the year. This is back in 2009. The little red dots, which I hope you can see, are the locations where the right whales actually turned up. And the colored areas are the areas where we forecasted they would be. So you can actually do pretty well through an ecosystem model and some good computational tools and a little bit of math geekiness at forecasting where whales are going to be. Of course, this all relies on some pretty thorough surveys and data from satellites. So, to sort of summarize what an ecosystem modeler does, we're trying to synthesize lots of processes. An ecosystem, like I said, is a complex place. There are lots of things going on from physics to chemistry to biology to ecology. And our job is to use math and computer science to bring those all together and make those sorts of moving maps. You have to be a wicked geek to do it, but luckily I am. And that helps us to understand these sort of past events and can also help us make predictions about the future. And hopefully give us some added insights into the way the ecosystem works as a whole, rather than sort of the reductionist approach that science typically takes. Okay, so let's move on to the broader picture of the Gulf of Maine. So the first thing I'd like to do, I titled this section of the talk, Ye Olde Gulf of Maine. I think when you want to take a look at the past 40 years, it's important to actually take a step even further back and ask, what was the Gulf of Maine like a long time ago? And what has it been doing leading up to those 40 years? I'm going to start, so this is sort of one of the early cartographs of the Gulf of Maine. It looks a little strange, so I'm going to go to one that looks even stranger to anyone familiar with the current maps. This is the Gulf of Maine as it looked about 10,000 years ago. We were coming out of the last ice age. You can see these dotted lines where the ice sheet is retreating. And this area where the Gulf of Maine now is, actually there was land extending all the way out where George's Bank is. And there were people out there. They're hunting animals like mastodons. Fishermen have even pulled up mastodon tusks. While fishing out there, it's pretty interesting. The Gulf of Maine at that time was a very different system. Because of these barriers, it was sheltered from a lot of the massive tides that we have now and the sort of counterclockwise currents that define the structure of the Gulf and the ecosystem that arises on top of that. They weren't really there at that time, or most likely. And it wasn't until really just the past few thousand years that the water level rose up over George's Bank and created the physics underlying the ecosystem that we have right now. This is summarized well in a quote by Spencer Apollonia, who is actually somewhere in the audience. the Gulf of Maine as we know it is much younger than the beginning of recorded human history. So I think it's really interesting to think of that Gulf that we see out there right now as taking a form similar to what it's like around the time of maybe the ancient Greeks or the Romans. Prior to that, it looked like a very different system. So by ecosystem standards, it's a young system. So fast forward a few hundred years, when Europeans started coming to the Gulf of Maine, one of, if not the primary reason, was because of the huge, almost unfathomable at that time, abundance of codfish. This is a great quote by John Cabot. Cod appeared so thick that a person could walk across their backs. And here he was talking about the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, but it was the same story in the Gulf of Maine. People described shoals of cod so thick that they would impede the progress of ships. People described being able to dip their baskets over the side and just fill them with fish and pull them aboard. And one of the main reasons that the first settlements by Europeans arose in Maine was to harvest this resource and send it back to Europe. This is down on the right, you just see a plot kind of showing the cod stock collapse that we're familiar with today. Similar declines have been described almost every generation as you go back. Many generations describe the abundance and the size of the fish as being greatly diminished as compared to when their grandparents were fishing. So it's not just the last 40 years that we've seen these declines, it actually goes way back. People were able to harvest right from shore these, fill their boats with just using jig lines with cod at levels comparable to what we're harvesting throughout the whole Gulf today. So it's a very different system 500 years ago. Even a couple of hundred years ago, hunters in small watercraft were pursuing right whales from shore. So the abundance of whales was off the charts compared to what it looks like today. And before whalers were rounding the Cape of Good Horn to hunt whales, Cape Horn, sorry, to hunt whales in the Pacific, there were so many off our shores that you could see them from shore and hunt them from small watercraft. And then down at the bottom, I couldn't find a good time series of the northern right whale, so here's the southern right whale crashing in the 1800s, and all these sort of larger, faster whales fell subject to the same intensive whaling pressure and eventually collapsed. So this is true through most of the globe, but especially in the Gulf of Maine. We used to have a lot more large whales than we have now. There are lots and lots of examples like this. I'm just going to show you one more because I like the quote. This is Nathaniel Hawthorne when he was living on Sebago Lake. I caught a black-spotted trout that was almost a whale. It weighed 18.5 pounds. Now this isn't the Gulf of Maine, but it speaks to how much larger fish were at the time. If you look on the Maine.gov website now for this species, which is also called Sebago salmon, the average size is about 1 to 1.5 pounds. And it says they commonly can be found at 3 to 5 pounds. So totally different ballpark. So like I said, examples go on and on. I mean, I think of lots of times when I drive over the Piscataqua River Bridge, I think about these large schools of bluefin tuna aggregating at the mouth of the river and probably targeting the huge runs of salmon that were once going up our rivers. It's just a very different system that we look out on over the water now. So, the take-home message is here. If we begin just 40 years ago, the Gulf of Maine was already far from the historical baseline. I focused on this 40-year period because of this kind of theme of Bigelow's history going back 40 years. But there's a lot of change that's happened leading up to that. And then the second point is that the idea of a baseline is a little bit misleading because as I've said, as you go back further and further, there's sort of ongoing change all the way back to the retreat of ice at the last ice age. So this idea that there was once this kind of constant, pristine state of the Gulf of Maine is a little bit misleading to begin with. So that gives you a little bit of context of what we're looking at now. I'd like to get into the last 40 years. So to set this up, I'm going to go through a timeline. Here we've got 1970 going up through present day. Like I said, this 40 years is because of the founding of Bigelow Lab back in 1974, so I put that on the timeline. It was also the year that the Rubik's Cube was invented, so a momentous event for geeks like me who love that sort of puzzle. It was also, incidentally, the year Leonardo DiCaprio was born. So moving forward in time, I wasn't actually born yet in 1974. I didn't come along until later in the 70s. So here we have my birth, perhaps less momentous than Leonardo DiCaprio's, but pretty important for me. And at the time, I looked up the annual report at Bigelow, and they were using this new instrument called an STD for salinity, temperature, and depth. Thankfully, they've changed the name since then to CTD, for conductivity, temperature, and depth, which is now, so at the time, this was kind of a novelty. They were looking at how fresh water coming out of Sheepscot Estuary affects the Gulf. But this instrument is now in widespread usage. And in fact, has changed the way oceanography is done. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then just to kind of overlay a few events of the last 40 years, we have the Berlin Wall, the World Wide Web in the early 90s, of course Seinfeld spanning the late 80s to the 90s, the election of Obama. And over that, I overlaid this kind of satellite image of oceanography because this is really the era of satellite oceanography, which has, in addition to the CTD, maybe even more so, fundamentally changed the way we view the ocean. It's really been like turning on a light in a dark room. Okay, so now I'm going to use the same timeline and talk about a few of the iconic species in the Gulf of Maine. And to do that, I'm just going to show time series, which is one of the ways that we try to understand what's happening in this complex system. There's no way I'm going to be able to describe all of the details of everything that goes on, but I'll go through a few examples just to give a taste. So first, here's Atlantic salmon. These are the time series you're seeing are just indices of abundance. I believe they're salmon returns. This is in a paper by Kathy Mills. And it's just a few different regions, mostly Atlantic Canada, but the one from the United States includes the Gulf of Maine. You can see in the 1980s, there was perhaps the hint of a decline. When we get into the 90s, things just basically bottom out. And in this case, they haven't recovered. Another example, the Atlantic bluefin tuna, also an iconic species that is harvested in the Gulf of Maine, and actually, arguably, a pretty well-managed fishery, despite the fact that bluefin tuna fisheries get a pretty bad rap. I think a lot of that, in my opinion, comes from Europe, and the Gulf of Maine is actually probably pretty good. But in any case, the time series you're seeing here is not the abundance of tuna, but their condition. So sort of like right whales, tuna spend part of the year in the Gulf of Maine to feed because we have such good, fat-rich, abundant resources for them to eat. And what this time series is showing, this is some work by Walt Gillette, who's at the University of Maine. It shows essentially how fat the tuna are when they finish at the end of their feeding season, which is going to feed into how well they reproduce the next year. So you can see again in the 1980s there's a little bit of a drop. And then in the 90s, there are these two sort of dips where they really bottom out. And perhaps they recover a little bit from that coming into the 2000s. But again, the 90s is a really sort of defining period. This is a neat paper. This is not necessarily an iconic species, but I thought it was an interesting study by Jason Link. He was interested in looking at if there are any changes in jellyfish or gelatinous species. And it's a type of organism that's really hard to get a handle on because there isn't much data. So what he used was the stomach contents of dogfish, which is an abundant type of shark that we have in the Gulf of Maine. And they eat this type of gelatinous plankton. These are ctenophores, by the way. They're called comb jellies. And so he described a gradual increase going from 1980 to 2000. I don't know what it looks like since 2000, but I would actually describe this not so much as a gradual increase, but again as a jump in the 1990s. And then one final one, going back to one of my friends, the northern right whale. This time series shows the calving rate. So right whales, one of the reasons they've been slow to recover is because it takes them 3 years before they can produce another calf. There's a 1-year gestation, 1 year sort of nursing and weaning, and then another year to essentially build enough fat back up to do it again. And so the calving rate is really important. And again, you see these two dips in the 1990s where the calving rate really bottoms out. And in fact, when I started on some of these right whale projects in the early 2000s, there were people out there saying this species is headed for extinction. The calving rate is too low, mortality rate is too high, and it's a doomed species. Fortunately, I grabbed the time series from 2000 onward, and things have looked quite a bit better since then. So this gives you a flavor. You can do this with all kinds of time series, and people have done just that. The next slide I'm going to show you is a little bit busy, but don't look at it too hard or you might get a headache. What all this is doing is taking time series like I showed you, and instead of showing zigzags up and down, they indicate those by color. So each row going across is similar to a time series that I showed. The top ones have to do with phytoplankton and zooplankton, and there's some jellyfish there. As you go down, it gets into fish and sharks and crabs and lobsters, and moving even further down, there are these other sort of ecosystem indicators that have to do with temperature and so on. And when you put all these together, you start to see a pattern. This was a study out of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And they highlighted the 1990s as this transition period where things changed kind of across the board. And you can kind of see that based on the colors here. You can do statistical analyses that sort of bring this out even more. And so the question is, what happened in the 1990s? And this is what I'm going to focus on. There were a lot of things that happened in the 90s, but most of them didn't relate to the Gulf of Maine. But this is what I'm going to focus on for the next part of the talk. There are a lot of possible explanations for what happened. Certainly, fishing played a role, but I'm going to walk through another hypothesis that has to do with the physics and the biology and the climate of the ocean that I think explains a lot of the changes, and it's one of the leading hypotheses behind these changes. So you'll have to kind of follow me down the rabbit hole a little bit. I hope I don't lose you too much with this part of the talk. But it goes back to Henry Bigelow, who was doing surveys back in the early 20th century. One of his famous quotes is, "All fish is diatoms." Another way to say that is the animals in the ocean are essentially made up of the single-celled microbes that form the base of the food web. So you have phytoplankton that really sets off the food web, and everything on top of that relies on that as a resource. That was one of his fundamental insights, that we should be thinking about microbes if we want to understand fish. Now he was going around in a schooner, sampling these different stations where you see the dots, making maps like that, which is quite a bit different from how we do things today, but similar in philosophy. One of his great contributions was this philosophy that I carry with me in my ecosystem modeling, that to really understand the ocean, you need to combine physics, chemistry, biology, and ecology into sort of one, and even geology, into sort of one synthetic picture of what's going on. So fast forward to the satellite era. Unfortunately, that picture didn't come out too well, but this is sort of how we're taking snapshots of much of the Gulf of Maine now. I really just wanted to show a couple of gratuitous satellite shots, so too bad it didn't come out. This is a little bit of a clearer version. You can see the greenness from outer space. And we've got decades and decades of data, this type of data now, as well as other sources of data. So what you're seeing is chlorophyll, and that essentially sets up the food web in the Gulf of Maine, these blooms of phytoplankton. So if you were to take that data and put it along a time axis, what I'm showing here is 1 year, sort of a typical year in Jordan Basin, which is in the eastern part of the Gulf of Maine. And on the y-axis, the vertical axis, is the amount of chlorophyll in the water, essentially telling you how much phytoplankton is there. And what jumps out is that in the spring, so these two bumps in sort of March and April, there are these big phytoplankton blooms. And that tends to happen pretty much every year. There are different timings at different years in different parts of the Gulf, but that's one of the characteristics of the Gulf of Maine, the spring phytoplankton bloom. And then things go down, and then later on in the fall, there's a smaller bloom, typically a smaller bloom. And these patterns are fairly consistent throughout the Gulf. And here are just a few microscopic images of some of the phytoplankton species in the Gulf of Maine. These are some images by Pete Countway, who's at Bigelow, who has just taken some really beautiful pictures. Okay, so we have these spring blooms, and then following from that, we have all of the zooplankton that eat the phytoplankton. This is another microscope slide. This picture is by Rebecca Jones, who was at the University of Maine at the time. These are, almost all of what you're seeing are copepods. It's this tiny crustacean. It's some of what I was showing in the model before. When you put a net in the Gulf of Maine, almost entirely what you pull up in terms of the zooplankton community are copepods. They dominate the world's ocean, in fact. It's probably the most abundant animal on the planet, some would argue. And this is a mix of the smaller species that you find in the Gulf of Maine, and then one palanis, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so these guys eat the phytoplankton bloom, and then other zooplankton eat them. These are some of my favorites. This is a chaetognath, or an arrowworm. It's this little sort of floating worm that has its teeth outside of its mouth and grabs on the copepods. This is another comb jelly, or ctenophore, that we've been seeing more of lately in the Gulf of Maine, which eats other jellies. And then that's just a larval flounder. And so larval fish also depend on that that zooplankton resource, and in fact, the fisheries management will survey zooplankton to get a sense of what the fish populations will look like a few years down the road as larval fish grow. So just to stop for a minute, I want to show another zooplankton slide. So this is another copepod called Calanus fremarchicus. These two images are the same size scale. This is, and all these big guys are seeing is one species. Calanus is really the dominant copepod in the Gulf of Maine and up into the subarctic and Arctic. And I'm highlighting it here because it's really a keystone species in the Gulf of Maine. The reason why is that it has this winter hibernation. We have these really cold winters, and it's adapted to that by putting on all of this fat based on these spring phytoplankton blooms, storing up a lot of fat in these lipid sacs that you can sort of see in the image, just those little bubbles you see in the back, and going to deep water and overwintering. What that means for the rest of the species in the Gulf of Maine is that there's this sort of huge supply of mini cheeseburgers sort of throughout the late summer, autumn, and winter, and then re-emerging again in the spring. And that really changes the texture of the ecosystem. You sort of find this species from the Gulf of Maine northward, and everywhere you do, you tend to find more lipid-rich and more abundant fish, and also marine mammals that tend to hit those, and seabird populations. A lot of these sort of productive food webs depend on this species or species very similar to that. So I just wanted to highlight Calanus. And then, like I said, whales, so the right whale eats this species. Herring, which is another sort of keystone species in the Gulf of Maine, relies on that and the other copepods, and that can feed up to higher trophic levels like tuna and so on. So that's kind of the way the season plays out in the Gulf of Maine. What does this have to do with the 1990s? So to understand that, we take another step back. This is a paper by Chuck Green at Cornell, and he's trying to describe what happened in the 90s in the Gulf of Maine based on what was happening in the Arctic. So this is where we start going down the rabbit hole a little bit, but hopefully you can follow along. The Arctic has these climate oscillations that are similar in some ways to what we're more familiar with, like El Nino and La Nina, where we have this flip-flop between these warm and cold conditions. There are similar climate oscillations going on actually in lots of places in the world ocean, including the Arctic. And the oceanic index in the Arctic is called the Arctic Ocean Oscillation. And that's what you see up at the top right. It's a plot of the red is when it's positive, the blue is when it's negative. And if you see that last sort of dip into the blue, that's the 1990s. So there was these two big negative sort of dips in the Arctic Ocean Oscillation in the 90s. And what happens when you get these negative indices is that you get these pulses of less salty water, essentially, coming out of the Arctic, or an increase in flow of this sort of fresher, colder water from the Arctic. And that can follow its way all the way down along the continental shelf from Canada down into the United States, along the Labrador Current, that's the LC there. Some of it goes into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, some of it follows along the Scotian Shelf, and ultimately, much of it winds up in the Gulf of Maine. So if you sort of follow all of these plots going down along what's happening in the 90s, the next one down is a salinity index. And the fact that it's low in the 90s indicates that water was fresher. The next one down is called the Autumn Phytoplankton Color Index. And this is directly from the Gulf of Maine. And what this is showing is the size of that fall phytoplankton bloom that I showed you. There's a pronounced spring bloom and then a less pronounced fall bloom. But in fact, in the 90s, all throughout the 90s in the Gulf of Maine, those blooms were more pronounced because of the effect of this fresh water, and it sort of added this stratified lens, this fresher, cooler lens of water on top of the surface of the Gulf of Maine, and that allowed these fall blooms to go on for longer and be larger. As you go down one more step, you have the abundance of those small copepods. So the first zooplankton slide I showed you was all those tiny species of copepods. They really liked those fall blooms. They really took advantage of the extra food in the fall and lasted further throughout the winter and so on. And so you had a higher abundance of tiny zooplankton. And then jumping down to the very bottom, this is Calanus, that keystone species. It had exactly the opposite response. You can see those two blue dips in the 90s. So that they had the opposite response to the small copepods. They had a really low abundance in the 90s. You can follow this sort of physical feature from the Arctic down into the Gulf of Maine, feeding into the biology, and ultimately to these sort of higher trophic level species like zooplankton. So then if we return to some of our iconic species like the right whale, this top plot again is just that calving rate time series I showed you before with those two big dips in the 90s. If you look at the time series of Calanus, these are sort of lined up together, you see two similar dips in the 90s. And in fact, they predate by 2 or 3 years those dips in the calving rate. And if you apply some modeling equations to that, you can calculate sort of based on that 3-year cycle of when right whales can reproduce, you can put together a model of when we would expect this food resource to impact their calving rate. And this is in fact what you see with the gray sort of underlaying that time series is what the model predicts. This is a model by Chuck Green and Andy Persian. And so using this Calanus time series, we can actually predict that right whale calving rate quite well. So in addition to the sort of management efforts we might take to reduce mortality, we also need to have an understanding of the basic oceanography coming from the physics through the microbes up through the food web. And I'll just hit on one other example that I mentioned, and that's the decline in the condition of the bluefin tuna. So here on the bottom, I've shown again that same time series showing how the condition, or essentially how fat the tuna are, has been declining since 1980 through the present. When tuna are in the Gulf of Maine, they're primarily eating herring. It's something like 70 to 80% of their diet. And what was paradoxical to us when we first looked at this is that if you look up here, this is the herring time series over that same time period. In the 1990s, again, the 90s showed this really big shift, but it was toward a much higher abundance of herring. And so we were curious as to what the explanation would be for this apparent paradox that when the food resource for tuna is so good, why is their condition getting so bad? It's almost entirely what they're eating while they're here. And what we found, so this is some work by Walt Gillette, and what he found when he did a little bit of digging into this is that at the same time the abundance of herring was surging, their size was declining. So there was a disappearance of the sort of larger herring, and the smaller, younger herring were really dominating. And what that meant for tuna is that they have to spend more work getting the same amount of food. Essentially, every time they attack a fish, it takes a certain amount of energy, and so if they're attacking larger fish, they're doing better. And if they're attacking smaller fish, they have to do a lot more work, and that affects their condition. And we did a little bit, we sort of assigned the equations that describe that and tried to make some predictions based on that. And so the red line is essentially what you predict of diet profitability based on the size of herring. And we found that it matched the tuna time series almost exactly. So again, what's happening is this sort of unexpected effect, likely coming up through the oceanography and up through the food web, affecting this time not the abundance but the size of prey species and working its way up to tuna. So I'm not going to go through all of the examples and all of the time series. I just want to sort of wrap up with a couple of points. The first one, these multi-decadal time series are crucial to understanding how ecosystems change. Some of them that we have do go back 40 years. Some of the paleo data we have goes back even further. But without that information, we would be sort of fumbling around in the dark. We would be trying to describe what happens from one year to the next without real context. And then the other point is that many changes originate in climate and physical conditions and work their way up through the food web. Overfishing certainly does have an impact, and a lot of the blame, and I would say in some cases too much of the blame goes in that direction, and if we really want to understand what's happening, we need to pay equal attention to what's happening with the climate and at the base of the food web. Okay, so the final part of my talk, I mentioned I would talk a little bit about what's happening in the Gulf of Maine today, and what are some of the questions that we're asking now. Of course, I've only just scratched the surface of what's going on in the ecosystem, but there still are some really major stories happening right now. What this map shows, this is a map I put together from sea surface temperature data from satellites, and this shows the rate of warming in different parts of the ocean over the past 10 years. The yellow and red show areas where show essentially a positive trend in temperature, so warming. And then the blue areas show cooling, and the intensity shows how fast that warming or cooling is occurring. And what jumps out immediately is that the Gulf of Maine is the darkest red that you find, and the areas around the Gulf of Maine. And in fact, over the past 10 years, our waters have warmed faster than 99.9% of the world's oceans. This is really striking. It's something like 10 times the background rate of warming. And we've seen a lot of changes come along with that. A couple of the other headlines from the last 10 years. This is some work by Barney Balch, who's been running transects across the Gulf of Maine for around 15 years now, and done some other studies. And he's found that 4 of the top 10 wettest years on record, so in terms of precipitation, were in the last decade. So going back over a century, if you took the top 10 wettest years, 4 of those come in the last decade. So we're getting these noticeable changes in precipitation patterns. And then he also noticed this 5-fold drop in primary productivity. So the phytoplankton that makes up the base of the food web, in around 2005 or 2006, I think, there was this sort of precipitous drop in productivity. There's some evidence that that might be coming back, but the jury is still out on that one. So that kind of gives you the sense of the last 10 years. A couple of years ago, in 2012, we had this record warm year that was just off the charts. And in fact, there was a meeting organized where a bunch of scientists from around the region, we all got together and basically talked about what happened in 2012 from all different parts of the ecosystem. This is one of the slides that I grabbed from a presentation by Alan Wanamaker, who does paleo reconstruction of temperature by looking at clamshells, actually. And you can recreate temperature going back a few hundred years that way. This is one of the striking slides of that meeting to me, so I sort of stole it for this presentation. So the sort of yellowish or greenish, whatever color that is, line shows you the temperature going back to about 1680. You can see it goes up and down. There are these warm and cold periods that we've observed. And then that dot up there is what it looked like for 2012. We were 2 or 3 degrees warmer than essentially anything going back hundreds of years. This was really striking. And it was also striking listening to the stories that other scientists were telling from different parts of the Gulf of Maine food web. One that made the press a lot was what happened in the lobster fishery. So essentially, the lobsters have an annual migration that's triggered by temperature. And these warm conditions basically meant that that trigger was hit earlier in the year, and all these lobsters migrated inshore about a month earlier than they typically do. And this had sort of a chain reaction throughout the supply chain. It meant that a lot of lobsters were being caught early. The processing plants weren't ready for it because they weren't expecting it to come for another month. And you had this big surplus of lobster building up and just being held in the water alongside of docks. That drove the prices down and caused this big ruckus throughout the lobster fishery. And really did a lot of damage. 2013, we went a little bit back toward normal, still warm, but more normal conditions. But we may have more warm years like this in the future. Another thing that was interesting that happened was this longfin squid fishery popped up sort of overnight. We've never had a longfin squid fishery here before. It's more of a warm water species, but all of a sudden there it was off the mid-coast, and people started fishing it. A few of the other stories, there were some really drastic effects on seabird populations that were described by some folks at Maine Audubon and Project Puffin. This is a picture of a razorbill, which is one of my personal favorites, but they also have puffin colonies and tern colonies and so on. And they're rearing their chicks here in the summer, and they're essentially bringing back these small forage fish like juvenile hake and herring and things like that to feed their chicks as they grow. What they were seeing in 2012 was essentially those fish were missing, and they had been replaced by butterfish, which is more of a round sort of fish that the chicks couldn't swallow. And that caused these massive die-offs. So I don't know what the update on that one is in 2013. I think things have recovered a little bit since then. But they were describing razorbills flying far afield as Florida, looking for possibly new colonizing grounds, as conditions were just bad in the Gulf of Maine. Interestingly, those butterfish feed on comb jellies. And one of the things I observed a few times up and down the coast of Maine in 2012 were these unusually high abundances of comb jellies. I took a class of Bowdoin students out in the fall to pull up a net of copepods because they're essentially everywhere, and I was going to teach them all about copepods. And we didn't pull up a single one. I've never seen that in any sample in any cruise that I've ever been on, that you put in a zooplankton net and don't see any copepods. And instead what we were seeing is comb jellies. So that was pretty striking. And a couple of other people described that in different parts of the coast. And then there was, so in addition to some warmer water species moving up into the Gulf of Maine, there are some other, what I would say are really surprising visitors. What I've shown here is a couple of bowhead whales. These are Arctic species, and there were 2 sightings of bowhead whales in the Gulf of Maine, one in Cape Cod Bay and one in the Bay of Fundy. And we really never see those guys there. So I don't know, it doesn't really make sense that they would visit us in warmer conditions, yet they did. So it was a strange year. There were a lot of unexpected things happening. Interesting, a little bit scary perhaps. So where do we go from here? The next 40 years? What this all says to me is that the Gulf of Maine is a really important place to be watching right now. Because we've had this really fast rate of warming, in a way it's a window into what climate change could do to other parts of the ocean. It's been much faster than we expect climate change to be in general, but it may have some of you may see some of the same changes. So it's kind of an interesting case study. There are a number of issues that are going to come up in the coming decades. We're going to see more studies of ocean acidification, which you've probably heard a little bit about. I'm sure there are other speakers in this series who will talk about that. We're going to see probably more extreme weather and precipitation events. Sea level rise is becoming more and more of an issue, especially in southern Maine. And then there are other hypotheses out there, like there's a paper that came out a couple of years ago essentially forecasting that Calanus is going to be gone from the Gulf of Maine. It'll be too warm here, essentially, for that keystone species to exist. And that's going to have ripple effects throughout the food web. It's really hard to imagine a food web like the one we have persisting in the absence of that really critical species. So it's going to be really interesting and really important to pay attention over the next 40 years to what we can learn. So I hope that's not too gloom and doom. It's still it's still a beautiful place. I love the Gulf of Maine, and I'm always going to, no matter what it looks like, and I'm always going to find it an interesting place to do science. So I hope I've passed some of that interest on to you. And with that, I'd just like to thank you and open it up to questions.